otherwise she'll be in contempt of court. Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second day of the 2024 Mbali conference. My name is Lazelle Ramacho Calvino, and I'll be your program director today. To start off with quickly, a warm welcome to all the executive management in absentia, Professor Tavari, the father of this conference, and I'm sure he's getting tired to hear it, but Prof, it's the truth. The mother of our faculty, Professor Greiling, the chairperson of the Mbali Conference Committee, Professor Kasiram, and a special warm word of welcome to Prof. Siepe, who will be our keynote speaker this morning. Just a few house rules or house aspects that we need to address. If you don't mind, it will take a few seconds. First and foremost, there's a gala dinner tonight. If you have not received your gala dinner invitation as of yet, please make sure to collect it at the registration table. You're all welcome to please attend the gala dinner tonight. It will be quite an interesting gathering of people and some interesting entertainment as well, I believe. Charlene has offered to take off his shirt and do some dancing, so I'm sure it will be very fascinating. Ladies and gentlemen, then furthermore, there's a boat ride. So just before lunch, if you could sneak away a few minutes before lunch and just go and help yourself to some lunch and then go on the boat ride. You can do the Titanic imitation like some people have done yesterday. I won't mention names. But that's also always fun to do as well. And then there's also the village tour on Thursday. If you're still interested in attending the village tour, please just go to reception or registration table and just put your name on the list so you can join us on Thursday for the village tour. Then lastly, you will notice on the outside of the venue, you'll see Van Skyks as well as Oxford. Those are two of our, you're welcome, come in. Good morning. Those are two of our sponsors. First and foremost, Van Skyks. Oh, thank you. Van Skyks has got a book sale, so please also make sure that you pop by the stand and just look at their book prices. That's a phenomenal price. You can get books up to 20 Rand a book. Then Lost and Found. There's a cell phone that has been recovered and just brought to me. Prof. Kasiram, is it yours? Okay. Anyone else? Cell phone? I will leave it with Lisa. She's the conference manager if you would like to go and collect the phone. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'm going to ask Professor Ayer to please introduce to us our keynote speaker for this morning. Professor Ayer.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I can see that all of us look really excited for day 2 of our Mbali conference. In respect of conferences of this nature, I think many of us look for speakers who are vibrant, thought-provoking, and intellectually stimulating. And sometimes this is not easy to find. However, I had the privilege of listening to the next speaker, Prof. Siepe, for many years, and I can guarantee you that I was never disappointed. Now, who is Prof. Siepe? He is a physicist by training, currently a higher education consultant, but most of you would know him as our DVC institutional support at UniZulu a few years back. He holds 2 master's degrees, one in physics from Wits University and the other in technology in education from Harvard University, Massachusetts. He holds a PhD from Northwest University, and he's a recipient of several scholarships, and the most prestigious being the Harvard Fellowship and the Senior Research Fulbright Fellowship. He served as a special advisor in several ministries. He is a former associate political editor and columnist for the Mail and Guardian and Business Day. I'm sure most of you have seen his handsome face on television as a political analyst and commentator. And believe me when I say he doesn't mince his words. Recently at our university, UniZulu, he's been conducting numerous workshops, and we all are aware that he's passionate about promoting the African node of thought at our university and other institutions in higher education. With those words, I'd like to welcome Prof. Sipho Siepe. Thank you.
I need the guys from IT to come and help me with setting up so that we can get going. Good morning, Dumelang. Good morning. Okay, I thought I'm not audible, you know. Well, I'm pleased to have been invited again to this exciting conference, which has become an annual pilgrimage for most of the scholars in this country, and also some of the partners who come from a number of countries. And Professor Khalin did manage to ensure that they are properly acknowledged, so I don't have to do that. I was also pleased to have been here when she opened the conference, and also indicating how far this conference has come. But what she was doing was to emphasize the importance of ideas, that what you think, you become. And I always tell people the story of how that has been expressed by a number of people, and some have always said, from our former founding president has always said, it always seems impossible until it is done. And Margaret Thatcher put it this way, that she is interested in ideas and not emotions, because with ideas you can turn them into words, and words can be turned into action. And when action is repeated, it can be turned into habit. And habit defines your character, and your character ultimately defines your destiny. So that is what probably I assume that the organizers of this conference and the early thinkers about it imagined. And today, the Vice Chancellor was correct to say this Mbali conference, which is now annual, has become one of the flagships of this university. And I think Professor Hayden and your Deputy Dean, you can pat yourself on the back. And I think that it's worth giving them. In line with also rethinking where we are going, this year's theme has also been very provocative, profound, and very idealistic. Idealistic in the sense that first part of it is about understanding our location, that we are part of the globe. So the idea of resilience, African resilience, reshaping and influencing the global stage is the most ambitious one. And I'll indicate later why that is ambitious and why it is also correct. You are not going to achieve anything, anything without a form of ambition. But it's also a statement that the university is making, that it is not going to be joining those who are onlookers, but it assumes the role of being a participant. And what that means politically is that it means you stop being an object of history, but you become a subject of history, that you participate in history making. Effectively, if this conference is to be successful, you need to ask yourself at the end whether you have been able to succeed to respond to the question, what are those issues that need addressing to ensure that the continent bounce back? And the Vice Chancellor, in the introduction, tried to emphasize the issue of location. And she played around with that, both from a perspective of epistemic location, social location, and geographical location. And as my interlocutor and partner in crime will also indicate today after my presentation, Professor Akpome will try to emphasize the difference between epistemic location, geographic location, and social location. I'm doing this deliberately to make sure that he's taking notes. The Vice Chancellor also went on that such a shift is a shift of shifting the biology of reason and also shifting the geography of reason. We use these words, these terms, more as a way of putting a shorthand to what is otherwise a complex and complexity of ideas. And the Vice Chancellor also introduced for this gathering the concept of the colonial matrix of power, and also suggesting that it is very important that we understand how it works. And she went on to talk about that this reshaping cannot succeed without us addressing the epistemic forms of violence that has been visited on African people. And she talked and introduced concepts like epistemicides, which talks about something that deals with not only the denial, but also the destruction of African knowledge systems. She spoke about linguicides, cultural sites. These are very important concepts that if you're going to be engaged in this struggle, because this is a new form of struggle, we have been engaged in other forms of struggle, like political struggle. But the next struggle, and the most difficult one, is the struggle for cultural reclamation, is a struggle to ensure that our cultures do not continue to be marginalized. So we need to see Africa as also a place of, or put it as a legitimate epistemic base on which we can actually create knowledge. She then ended by saying, it is, most importantly, given our experience, a challenge of rethinking about thinking itself. And of course, given the extent of the damage that colonialism has done on our psyche, it is also an opportunity for us to learn, to unlearn in order to relearn. And Professor Frelen did talk about Mbali as a flower, symbolically a flower that arises or raises from the ash on an annual basis. I see that as simply saying, at the end of the day, we should be saying what are the things that we can take forward in our engagement in this. So that is probably by way of introduction and the way of acknowledging the contribution that has been made. Guys, I'd like you guys to make sure that I share the screen with the colleagues here. I do not want to speak alone. Oh, there you are. Now, we live in a very interesting continent, and I call it a place of paradox. A paradox in the sense that Africa is one of the richest continents. When I was in Russia in December, they were talking about the riches of the subsoil and also the riches above the soil. And they talked about how they are harnessing and exploiting the riches, the subsoil riches, as well as the ocean, where they are actually busy mining. And if you guys don't know, there's also a new form of mining that is taking place in space. And for Professor Calvino, there's a very interesting legal question about who owns some of those spaces. And there's actually a decision that has been made in a court of law, because while you are busy fighting for land, other people are already fighting for celestial bodies and making claims, and they now talk about space mining. But the point is that the nature of knowledge is that it continues to expand. People continue to explore. Now, while Africa is a country that is rich with minerals, rich with human diversity, rich with culture, in 2025, the World Bank says it will also be home to 80% of the world's poor. And of course, this did not come by chance. We know that there's been colonialism, there's been also slavery. And what that did was to embark those processes, were processes that led to a pesticide, where Africa's resources were and continue to be expropriated, appropriated, plundered, and pillaged. And where Africans themselves have reached a stage where some of them have lost a sense of intellectual capacity and moral agency. And this is what this conference is supposed to do, to say, how do we address this paradox that we are home to a rich continent, yet the people of that continent continue to suffer from the conditions of squalor, of degrading poverty. Then, of course, we go back to the whole notion of colonialism. My colleagues who are here from the university will know that this is part of our repositioning of the university. But for us to reposition the university, we should know where we come from. And the Prime Minister of Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe, was the one who uttered something about Africans, which is also a form of a pesticide, but also the dehumanization of the African people. That he said, I would say colonialism is a wonderful thing. It spread civilization to Africa. Before it, they had no written language, no will as we know it, no schools, no hospitals, not even normal clothing, unquote. So you can see the attitude that pervaded in the minds of those who sought to appropriate the continent and its people for themselves. And of course, what we're engaged in, Professor Kredin, is really to say we need to write our story. And when the APSA, Mr. Mkhize was here, he emphasized the notion of we need to tell our story. And Chinua Achebe says, until the lions have their historians, tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunter. So we are the people who have been hunted, and it's about the time that we tell our story. If many of you have been there in the 80s, there was a movie called Jaws, which the producers thought they would try to see the perspective of the engagement between humans and the fish through the lens of the fish. I don't know whether they've done it successfully. But what we know, for us to reclaim the space, it cannot be without ideas. Hence, Karl Marx will always be relevant when he says the ideas of the ruling class. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production. And that statement is so important. It's important because it says, until you control the narrative, until you shape ideas, you'll always be an onlooker. So it is about emphasizing the centrality of ideas. And as I said, when we talk about this conference being successful, you need to ask yourself, what are the things that have emerged in this conference that will assist us to ensure that we use our resilience to influence and shape the global stage? If we do not do that, then we have not done justice to ourselves. And this is more of something that should always be on our minds as we listen to a number of speakers. Then I'll proceed to indicate that Winston Churchill put it very nicely when he says, the empires of the future are the empires of the mind. And that's very important because when he said this in 1943, the world was emerging from the Second World War. And in the continent of Africa, in South America, those countries were engaged in anti-colonial struggles. But he said that the struggles after the anti-colonial struggles have run their course, the battle lines will be in the cognitive space, where he says the empires of the future. And we see it with global capitalism, with the marginalization that continues, with the fact that in 2025, Africa, despite its richness, will be home to 80% of the world's poor. And of course, what it will require for us, before you can even talk about decolonization, you need to understand colonization. I had said earlier that the whole notion of reshaping, using African resilience to reshape the global stage is a decolonial challenge. And that challenge requires that you understand what you are suffering from before you can even come with a solution. Now, we know colonialism was not a benign encounter. It was violent. And also, it was also sustained by violence. And interestingly, that it also required a violent struggles to defeat it. But the most important aspect, which is important for those of us who are in the business of knowledge creation, is the impact and the element that is most significant of colonialism, which was the dehumanization. It's not only about annexation of land and its resources, but and also exploitation of the people there. It also involved dehumanizing them, making the people who are colonized feel less than human. And there's a reason why that is so. And of course, universities also participated in this, especially Western universities, where they began to study and come up with pseudo-scientific theories that the people who are colonized are subhuman. And there's a reason why they needed to also emphasize the aspect of dehumanization, that it's not only about reducing them to slavery, it's not only about taking what belongs to them, but it's also about making sure that they feel less than human. And when I say this, you also need to read Nelson Mandela when he talked about that. Even when they were in prison, one of the things that the regime tried to do is to destroy even their soul. And said we were dehumanized, we were embarrassed, we were stressed, but the whole notion was to make us feel less human. But what the regime could not control is our minds. They could control everything, our bodies, destroy our bodies, kill, but they could not penetrate our mind. And it is that which ultimately led to their still resolve to say they'll be free in their lifetime. And also because of that experience, they also said, we will not wish this even to our worst enemy. That's important, because part of fighting against the dehumanization is also an attempt to humanize the world. It is not because you are fighting against oppression because you are affected. Of course, there are people who have been engaged in struggles against oppression simply because they are affected. But when they have an opportunity, they also become the oppressors, because their struggle was never informed by the notion of a principal attack on oppression. It was more about because I'm involved. Hence, we've seen many becoming junior partners and also becoming enlisted in the oppression of their own people. And that applies to men and women, where women also assume the position, and instead of advancing women, become also part of the problem. So there's an issue of race and gender. And of course, in this country, we know that the form of humiliation and dehumanization took different forms. But for the West and the colonizers, the dehumanization served two purposes. The first purpose was to escape the apparent contradictions. If you claim that you are civilized and you claim to be good, the question would then be asked, how do you justify that by enslaving the people? So they had to address that contradiction, and that contradiction was resolved for them by saying, but the people we are oppressing are not human. So that was the first thing, that you had to, I mean, if you went to any child and you explain to them that there are certain people who look like us, who serve us, and we can kill, we can destroy, we can do whatever. Then when the child asks, because the children are innocent, they'll ask questions. They say, but no, they're not like us. Even when people get killed in large numbers, people say, no, they're not like us. But they're also saying they're subhuman. So you need to understand that the whole project of colonialism was also about categorizing people, about who shall live, where they shall live, and how they shall live. The second aspect of dehumanization was also to ensure that the colonized or the oppressed, they also lose in time their sense of selfhood. And this is what I call the lack of moral agency, where they ultimately accept their state of being victims, and they even start buying into the pseudo-philosophical explanation, where some people present themselves as the chosen ones. And I was always amazed when I was in the US that now and then, after the speech of the president, they will end up by saying, one country under God. And what it meant is that other countries were not under God. And it was always amazing to me how even they will pray, the priests will pray when there is a war, that God must save them and from being killed. But what it also means is that God must also assist in the killing of others. And actually, it reminds me of General Patton when he was asked whether he'll die for his country. And he said, hell no. I want the other bastard to die for his country. You know. But anyway, but the point is that when they go to war, you have the priest playing the role. But again, that is only possible when those who are colonizers start thinking that they are better than other human beings, you know. And of course, South Africa, we had more of an, how do you put it, unfinished expression of that sense of superiority. And Verwoerd was at least more honest in his approach to race relations. And he said that one, when I have control of native education, I will reform it so that natives will be taught from childhood to realize that equality with Europeans is not for them. That's the first part. And the second part is that there's no place for him, the African child, in a European society above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching a Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice? Now, most people gloss over that and they fail to understand how Verwoerd, who was trained as a psychologist, created what I call psychological entrapment. And I'll explain that. One, you should also understand this within the global setting. Because when you go, you take apartheid and you take it at the level of what you call global apartheid, you also see that there'll be divisions of labor. There'll be divisions of labor both at the intellectual and at the practical level. But I'll deal with that later. But before rushing out of that space, but Verwoerd also made a statement that is rarely quoted, Professor Aya. He says we must take the implementation of separate development so far that no future government will ever be able to reverse it. And when you look at where we are 30 years down the line, you just have to look at the material conditions of African people before 1994. You have the best constitution in the world, and you look at where we are. And then you realize that Verwoerd somehow was correct, that will implement this so that no future government will be able to reverse it. But part of the issue why we fail to reverse it is also why we're here, to deal with issues of knowledge, to deal with issues of ideas. But for young people, they need to also understand that what Verwoerd was saying about that you need to realize that equality with Europeans is not for Africans. To say that in itself became a psychological trap. A psychological trap in the sense that it forced black people wherever they are to try to be equal to Europeans. And they were doing that as if to prove Verwoerd wrong. But in a way, the Europeans or the white men or white women became the standard to which you measure your life. So effectively, it doesn't matter what you do. You'll always try to prove that you're equal to somebody. But when you are busy trying to be equal to somebody, what happens is that that person sets the agenda. They can, at any one time, continue to change the goalpost. This is why, post-1994, we saw most of us, so-called educated blacks, rushing into white spaces. I mean, if you go to the schools that produce people like me, schools that made it possible for me to be able to go and take teaching positions in American universities, those schools are empty. Because most of us suffer from the Verwoerdian prescription, where we're trying to prove that we can be equal to other people. And Ngugi says, it doesn't matter how much you try to be English. You can speak the English language with a twang. You can quote a lot of dead British men. But even the hobo in England, who does not have a house, will always be more English than you. So when the Vice Chancellor spoke about issues of epistemic location, and they're talking about epistemic violence, she was talking about that. But it's all about going back to Verwoerd, who said, I'm going to make sure that you guys are trapped. When we got an opportunity to get away from our people, we rushed. And in the US, the interesting thing that happened is that every time you have a black person moving into a white neighborhood, he's checked out. If there are two, there's a worry. If there are three, you see houses for sale. And you saw that in this country, in places like Don Park, which were largely white. If you go there, the only white person who remains there is one who can't escape because they cannot afford. But again, it goes back to what Verwoerd said, that we suffer from that colonial and or what do you call Verwoerdian prescription, where we are always trying to prove that. But again, that is what coloniality is all about. And the scholars in South America told us that we could have known this. Grossvogel put it there, that one of the big mistakes that has been made is the assumption that when Kwame Nkrumah said, seek ye first the political kingdom, everything will follow. Kwame Nkrumah has been proven wrong. That yes, we can get the political kingdom, but until you address the cultural space, you are not yet in control. And he says, Grossvogel says, one of the most powerful myths of the 20th century was the notion that the elimination of colonial administration amounted to the decolonization of the world. So this is why at the University of Zululand, the council of the university decided to say, this will be a place or a note for African thought. It is really about dealing with the unfinished business. Mandela put it very nicely that the greatest secret that he discovered is after climbing a great hill, one discovers that there are many more hills to climb. But he says, what I will do is to take a rest to look at the vista that surrounds me and understand that my struggle has not come to an end, because with freedom comes responsibility. Now, Professor Agbume, the successful effect of all colonialism has been successful to the extent that it has made even people, when they are given even minimum space of freedom, they do not want that. And this illustrates the challenge that we have, Professor Khairin, that our chains of today are largely mental, not physical. So you see, if you know, like a horse, when it's been on the leash for a long time, even a dog, even when you remove, I think the dog will even do better. When you remove that, it remains there because it still thinks that it is contained. And we've seen a lot of our people behaving the same way, that even when there's a sense of freedom, they still behave as if they are under, they are still controlled. They are still in the leash. And of course, as we are saying, we are prisoners of our own making. And I would like to give a few examples of driving this home. And it's very important because it goes back to the concept of my talk of what I call epistemic justice. That until you deal with epistemic justice, you'll never be able to solve social justice. That it is really at the level of thinking in the mind, at the level of epistemology, that violence takes place. You see, the most obvious form of it is when our leaders go to places like the UN. And when they address the UN, they make sure that they speak in languages of their colonizers, as if they don't have their own languages. But you find people, the president of China, who can speak English fluently, but when he takes a podium, he'll speak in his own language, because he's saying, I'm Chinese. When the president of France, who speaks English quite fluently too, when they take a podium, they speak in French, because they say, this is who I am. Only colonized people think differently. They want to impress how good they are. And yet, there's really nothing wrong. But because the chains are now in their heads, they behave accordingly. That is what also miseducation was all about. The worst thing in this country, which I always complain about, is in the court of injustice. Well, Professor Calvino will talk about court of justice, but and Professor Aya. But when you go, and I always give an example of what happened to me, as a good example, when I got a speed fine. And it was not even a speed fine, it was more around, I was accused of having crossed the barrier line at night by somebody who was far away, and I knew that I had not. And I wanted to go to court to make a case and to say you could not have seen me. And it was at night, and I saw and which actually, truthfully, I was right. But the traffic cop insisted that I crossed the barrier. I went to court, and I see some fellows from Limpopo here. It was Naboom Spruit. And when I appeared before court, because I had time, I said, let me go and deal with this issue. Not that I could not pay the money. It was just a principle thing. And the magistrate spoke to me, and I requested that I should can we engage this in English? And all I was doing is that I'm very comfortable. I would have preferred Soto, but I also understood that would be asking too much, Nonetheless, the magistrate asked the prosecutor if it is possible, and the prosecutor said, no, I'll get a translator. I said, no, I'd like to use my language. And the traffic cop also insisted in Afrikaans. But what they were doing, they simply saying, they want to engage in in the language that is a mental home, so that they can express themselves clearly. So ultimately, of course, it was 3 against 1. It was a magistrate, it was a traffic cop, it was a prosecutor, it was also a black guy who was eager to translate or interpret whatever, But then nonetheless, the long and short of it, Professor Haley, is that I end up paying the fine. Although it was reduced a little bit. But the point that was registered is that they wanted the transaction to be in the language of their own. But now here's something that is worse, is that you go to Umtata, where the accused or the suspect, or it's accused, once he appears there, he's no longer a suspect. The accused is Xhosa speaking. The magistrate is Xhosa speaking. The prosecutor is Xhosa speaking. And the eager interpreter is also Xhosa speaking. But they have to speak in a language that all of them, they're not even fluent in. So you can understand the damage that's done in terms of a loss of translation, where people end up in jail because there was a loss of translation. But we call this courts a court of justice. When everywhere else, people will insist that, but what it does, it makes Africans start thinking that justice can only be transacted in a language that's not their own. But this is where you call it epistemic violence that takes place. And yet the people who sit there, they talk about the court of justice or the court where you will get justice. And of course, there's a debate that is taking place whether these are courts of justice or courts of law. I think in this country we veer more on the side of the court of law. Actually, I remember there's a case, a famous case where a young man in the U.S. appeared before the court, and after giving his opening address, the judge said, Mr. So-and-so, just hold it there. This is a court of law, not a court of justice. If you want justice, go out. So there's a distinction. Of course, where the courts under apartheid, they were courts of law, they were not courts of justice. So that's one good example that you should know. That's why many people who had not done anything end up being in prison, simply because they wanted freedom. So you can't say those who want freedom have actually acted unlawfully. So that is one aspect of what you call not only a linguicide, but epistemic violence. The South African universities decided not so long ago that they will require all their students who are studying medicine to learn at least one African language. And part of it is obvious that if most of your clients are going to be speaking in a different language, it is better for you to at least have access to that language, because then you can provide a proper, and anybody who has been to doctors knows that the first thing that the doctor does before examining you is to want to hear your story. And there's a reason why that is so, because it is on the base of your story that they can eliminate many other causes that are not related. But if a person cannot even explain to the doctor what's a problem, and some doctors will tell you that when I ask them, the person simply says, it's painful all over, because they don't have, and the doctor is not able to, So the decision that has been taken by the universities is also to address that epistemic violence. So that's why epistemic justice is important for social justice. So those are two examples that I'll give. Then, of course, how you position yourself in the world also determines how you'll be treated. Professor Kasserim, when the Queen died, African leaders hurriedly changed their schedule to go to the funeral. And when they got to the funeral, they were put in a bus. And you can see the president of Zimbabwe was assigned the responsibility of driving Africans in a bus. And you can see other African presidents are very happy, including our own, in a bus. That's what they give you. They give you a bus treatment. Because if you don't take yourself seriously, and when they come home here, they have motorcades, some even up to 50, pretending to us. But we know when they go to London, there's a bus for them. We put them in the bus because that's what they deserve. And you can see the American president in the Beast, in the car, American car called the Beast, the most secured vehicle in the world. But again, we need to understand how epistemic violence manifests itself. Another example of epistemic violence is that when we had COVID-19, countries like Cuba acted with speed to try to find vaccines. And Cuba is very poor. We even give it money. But because they know who they are, they try to find a solution. A continent that has more than 1 billion people, we did nothing. The US And as I say, as a product of the US education, my own university, Harvard, was giving me a daily reports on what the university is doing with Massachusetts General Hospital, how they were cutting down, making sure that there's a floor that will only deal with the COVID-related cases, how they brought all sorts of experts, people who were specialists with ears, some specialists there with lungs, some specialists with blood and all that, to try to understand this virus that could kill people within 24 hours of the symptoms becoming apparent. But it was daily. In Africa, there was simply silence, no activity. But once the virus, the vaccine came, our leaders were now active, accusing the West of depriving them of the vaccines, even invoking language called apartheid vaccines, that now we are being denied our rights. And they were there. They even called, they met the SAU and denounced the world. And the people could not understand that if Cuba could try to find a solution, what's wrong with this 1 billion people continent? And part of it is because of the damage that colonialism has done. What it did, it removed both, or how to put it, vandalized their intellectual capacity and created a sense of doubt to an extent that they could not see themselves as agent of change. So what this conference and this university is supposed to do is simply to address that epistemic violence that was meted to African people. And what you need to do is, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions that you as a teacher, not a cheater, you're going to be able to put in your classroom to make sure that you address that. And of course, it's also understanding that the palace state of Africa is not an accident. It involved the centuries-long epistemicide, which involved vandalism, wanton destruction, denialism, and capturing all epistemic and ontological spaces. And I was very interested, very surprised, actually. It was one of the information that I got when I was teaching or engaged in some work in Bahrain. And I met guys from Iraq. And Professor Pume, what was fascinating about them is that they were concerned, not so much, I thought they would talk about the loss of life, but they were concerned about the vandalism that occurred by Americans, destroying what they call their own national heritage, the museums, because as the soldiers were going in there, you also had academics who were going there to steal some of their artifacts, cultural artifacts. So the notion of colonialism is not only about the acquisition of land, killing of the people, exploiting them. It's also about making sure that you destroy their national heritage. And that's, to me, they were actually crying about the 3,000 years of national heritage that got destroyed in a short space of time. I mean, you should look at what Syria looks like today. You look at what Gaza looks like today. And you look at the investment that is lost in terms of knowledge. So part of it was the vandalism. It was the destruction. It was denying people that they are able to create knowledge. And this also, for us here, it also led to the loss and marginalization of indigenous knowledge system. So part of our responsibility is how do we participate in the retrieval of Africa's knowledge? And that our Renaissance is central to that until we discover and we retrieve that knowledge system, we will always be second best, if not fourth best. And what we know, that today, it is not so much that you have material or natural resources. But those communities that are able to transform knowledge into products and services are the ones that succeed. So the fact that Africa is a rich continent, part of its failures has been more around the exploitation of those resources. It's not been able to transform the data that they receive into creation of products and services, which are anyway in demand. We've seen countries that have no resources being able to develop quickly. So there's Professor Akbume will probably talk about his quarrel with the notion of development. I'm triggering him to, these are this homework that I'm giving him, which I hope he'll be able to rise to the occasion in the next few minutes. So in understanding the Africa's palace state at the moment is that for as long as we remain primary producers of raw materials, will be condemned to the income pile. That those countries that fail to manipulate data, resources, and ideas will be the ones that will not do well. And in this regard, Africa has not fared well. But what it says is that we must ask the question of value add. And I need to give you this simple example because later I'm going to talk about it in intellectual terms. Time is always flying.
We'll rather have you than time.
You mean you'd rather have me than Professor Akbume? Oh, okay. Yeah, we have a very interesting scenario, Professor Aya, where Africa produces about 5 billion pounds of coffee. And this is a study that was done by KPMG. It's available. It's called Africa Rising 2014. And this coffee, 5 billion pounds of coffee, is taken out where it is processed outside. And then it is packaged, and it is branded, and it creates 100 billion pounds worth of an industry. So if you think about it, is that the raw material, which is coffee, is processed outside, that there's a value adding takes place outside the continent. And because of that value adding that takes place outside, there's also an element of industrialization. You create industries, coffee industry outside. And effectively also, you are also exporting not only raw material, also exporting jobs. And then we receive that finished product much more, we spend more money. And that example of coffee applies to all the raw materials, where they're taken as they are, and then they get processed outside, and products get made, and they are then sold to us. So this also explains why we are trapped in state of what particular income, whether you are called to be low income, or whether you are middle, but you are not able to escape because you have not used knowledge. So knowledge and the exploitation of knowledge would be something that would be central to the African Renaissance. It would be something that would be central to the idea of shaping the global stage. It is only through knowledge exploitation, knowledge creation, idea formation that will be able to reshape what we call the global stage. Otherwise, we'll remain victims of colonialism. And Biko put it very nicely that the type of a person who has emerged out of a colonial, even though he talks about black people from a perspective of South Africans, his take applies to the whole continent and also people elsewhere who are victims of colonialism. That the type of a black person we have today has lost his manhood. Reduced to an obliging shell, he looks with awe at the white power structure and accepts what he reads as the inevitable position. Celebrated achievements by whites in the field of science, which he understands only hazily, serve to make him rather convinced of the futility of resistance and throw away any hopes that change may ever come. That is the reality that we are dealing with. That until we understand the importance of infusing energy and a life into a shell, then we'll never be able to deal with the idea of reshaping the global stage. And going back to the point I was making around coffee, we also find that even academically, we are finding ourselves in the same position. That when we talk about the industrial vacuum that is created where we take the raw materials, you also find that in the educational space, there's also what you call a theoretical vacuum. In the economy, you're talking about the industrial vacuum. Here we're talking about where the theories are largely from outside, where Africa, where we are simply a field for a raw data gathering, but the processing of the data takes place. That's why when we write, we actually write material and quote the people, not the people who are in the continent, because most of the knowledge that is produced is largely by those who are able to create centers of knowledge, where there are laboratories of ideas, where there are laboratories. I worked, when I was doing my research at the master's level, I was engaged in trying to make, it was a mission impossible, trying to make diamond semiconducting. So I end up making it more like graphite, and I'll get more diamonds and, continuous. So I spent a lot of time working on diamonds, but unfortunately I'm still poor. But anyway, that's something else. But the main laboratories were not in this country. They were in London. So the notion that you're talking about the theoretical vacuum in Africa is also something that persists in the academy. And even when we talk about research, we always have to make sure that our research is also in a colonial language and teaching and learning. This is also part of the asymmetry that exists. And there are also politics of publication, something that I said that Karl Marx found out that those who control the means of production also control the means of intellectual production, that until you also occupy that space. And the Afrikaners are the best people who have actually done that, to simply say, in moving forward, we must create our own vehicles. They create their own institutions. And what the Africans have done all over the world is simply to adopt institutions that they found there without creating their own, that have a different logic. As Audre Lorde put it, that the master's tools will not destroy the master's house. If your intention was to undo the damage that the colonialism has done, simply adopting what you find is not going to be the answer. And of course, the answer lies in identifying a problem, because once the problem is identified, you know what needs to be done. And the first thing is we need to stop this gratuitous accession of respect and deference to Western traditional thoughts as universals of epistemes. It is not to say you reject them totally, but you must also accept that they should not start assuming, or they are assuming the notion of universalism when they are actually products of a particular context. What we have done is, and what Europeans have actually done, is to universalize their experience. That the small province of Europe, province of the world, has decided to impose itself and says this is a universal way of seeing. So if you understand that how colonialism occurred, and also understand the dehumanization, and also understand why you are not participating, why there's still a paradox, where you belong to a continent that is supposed to be very rich, or that is rich in terms of resources, but yet its inhabitants are poor, then you are going to be able to address the challenge. And of course, for us, it has always been clear that it has always been at the level of ideas. And if we are going to embark on this journey, you need to be armed with the cognitive tools. And hence, words like cognitive empire, coloniality of power, coloniality of being, coloniality of knowledge, and cultural schizophrenia. These are our terms that ultimately you need to have, because in them they are loaded. But what is loaded in them is a meaning. And if you understand that, they will also lead to the notion of practice. Like I said, ideas are always central to ultimately what defines your destiny. And Biko put it very clearly to say, we also need to understand how knowledge is colonized. But as he put it, that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And the success of the oppressor is when the oppressed begin to understand and accept that this is the only way, when you start assuming that your process is inevitable, that you can't even wiggle yourself out. You are like that horse that even though it is free, or the donkey, it still thinks that it's under bondage, that our challenge is no longer physical, but it is mental. So I've said, and we've said in our engagement, that the challenge we face, and we are inviting colleagues, as the Vice Chancellor said, from other universities, to say, if you're going to partner with us on this journey of reshaping the global stage, it will require three things. One, understanding the debilitating effects on the psyche of the victims. And it's also doing at least three things in terms of our curriculum, because ultimately, any transformation must find expression in the classroom. One is to unmask the Eurocentric negations of all other human experiences. Two is to reverse the silencing of African voices. That is, it's supposed to be reverse the erasure. I think the computer did something. Ensure that you reverse the erasure and the silencing of African voices. Then three is to undo the distortions of African realities. And one of the things that this becomes very clear is when people begin to talk to you about yourself, and you find that they have a completely distorted view on why you take certain positions. And that those distortions need to be dealt with. That sometimes our kindness is mistaken for weakness. And that is always a distorted. And that's one of the things that Mandela ultimately realized, that whenever he tried to reach out, that was never seen as reaching out. It was seen as a sign of weakness. And of course, we have stories of Africans complaining about when they welcome people, they little did they know that those people will be taking their land. When Jomo Kenyatta, who said that as soon as we stopped praying, we found that the land was gone. So we must deal with all those. But the long and short of it is, as I say, one, unmask Eurocentric negations of human experience, reverse the erasure and the silencing of African voices, undo the distortions of African realities. And of course, I'm not going to deal with a lot of manifestations that I've almost indicated of how epistemicide occurs. But it involves consistent, persistent, and meticulous, concerted, and systemic assault on and destruction of African knowledge systems, languages. The historical evidence of African civilization that is there is also devalued. There are materials that you can get. Hotunji has written extensively on that, and people like Emma Gwali on how there has been, how this assault had continued over a number of years. The slides for this are going to be available. So, Professor don't they feel shortchanged? I see your camera is working wonders, but you know. So I thought I would take it through that, but also to simply indicate that the best way to keep a prisoner from escaping is to make sure he never knows he's in prison. The shortest way of keeping a prisoner from escaping is to ensure that to make sure that he never knows. And this is where the control of the mind. That's why the challenge that we face today is the decolonization. So the idea of reshaping the global stage starts with the decolonial project, a decolonial challenge. And at the university, for those of you who were not part of the University of Zululand, we dealt with this by talking about things like understanding the politics of knowledge, and also dealing fully with how knowledge is colonized. And if you want people to assist you with that, come to the University of Zululand or ask any of the professors. They will take you through that. So they are here also to serve as consultants for knowledge creation. But we also understand that this will be a Herculean task. So I'd like to conclude by what JFK said. When in 1962 he was reflecting on the decision or the success by the Soviet Union when they put an artificial satellite in space in 1957. And later they also sent 2 dogs, female dogs, into space, and they came back alive. And when America realized that they've been outsmarted in the game or contest of technological and scientific supremacy, they decided that they will do better. They'll put a man on the moon. And he said, to addressing his compatriots, that we choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because the goal that will serve to, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and others too. And 10 years, less than 10 years later, a man walked on the moon. So this Herculean task is really about priming ourselves for the challenges that we face. At that time, people had not been closer to the moon. Today, some are hoping to have their honeymoon on the moon. Thank you.
My word, Prof. I've got so many buzzing words in my head currently. Courts of law and court of justice. Teaching, not cheaters. You know, words become habits, and habits become characteristics, and that determines your destiny. It's just such pearls of wisdom. So thank you very much for a very informative discussion. Prof. Greiling would like to hand over to you a small token of appreciation, if you don't mind, Prof. Greiling. And then we're going to have our panel discussion. We have gone over time a few minutes, but it was worth it, I think.
Giving you back Africa, because you are giving Africa back to us.
Stand for the camera. What we're going to do now is we're going to have our group discussion on decolonization, Africanization. Prof. Moyo, are you present? Prof. Apume, I know you here. You'd like to take a seat in the hot seat. Charlotte. I just want to bring this chair. I'm going to ask our bodybuilder here to bring your seat for you. We'll probably have to need Prof. Aya to assist the bodyguard. Are you the only one? Okay. Prof. Moyo is not present? Okay. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, there seems to be a small change in the program. Prof. Moyo unfortunately could not attend this morning, so I believe Prof. Pume, you will be making a response to Prof. Siepe's comments. Thank you very much.
Sanbonani, good morning. Good morning. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning. Okay. My task has been reduced. I've been required to just make a brief comment. I promise you it's going to be quite brief. I will not yield to the temptation to make this a way to introduce my presentation, which comes after break. I'm struggling to not yield to that temptation. I promise to not yield to that temptation. But whether I will fall into that temptation is, I can't say yet, but I'm trying to not yield to that temptation. But I want to thank Professor Siepe for another fantastic presentation. As I always, every time I have an opportunity, I tell him this, that the people who paid for him to go study physics in the US deserve a refund, because he has not demonstrated, as far as I know, that that was a very wise investment. But we thank you very much. I've benefited tremendously from interacting at closer quarters with Prof. Siepe, especially as we worked on conceptualizing UniZulu's strategic goal of becoming a node for African thought. I will try to respond to a few of the points he made, which is a difficult task because, as my friend and colleague Professor Morgan Nlovu stated in one webinar we had, the scholarly tradition into which we've been socialized requires the respondent to quarrel with the with the paper. And when you agree largely with the thoughts and the words of the speaker, then the scope for quarreling is reduced. But I will now construct the next. It's going to be a few minutes. I don't think we'll be sitting, Babtuala. Babtuala, I don't think we'll be sitting. I'm sorry. Yeah. So I'll probably maybe open up some areas where I think colleagues would like to think about from his talk. He made reference in one of the slides that he shared, a quote from Ramon Grossvogel, one of the leading decolonial scholars. I think he's from Puerto Rico. One of the points mentioned in Grossvogel's quote that Prof. Siepe used is, quote, the myth of the post-colonial world, end quote. I say this because there are several people, there are several colleagues who respond to the discourses of decolonization to say like, oh, come on, but decolonization ended long ago. And then in my background in literary studies, I actually do post-colonial literatures. Post-colonial Africa, the post-colonial world, where the prefix post operates semiotically, linguistically, to qualify colonialism, to consign colonialism to the past. And this is one of the problems that decolonial scholars, I think, have successfully dealt with by favoring another term, coloniality, instead of colonialism, where colonialism can easily be used to refer to the historical, and this is my formulation, historical colonization, which is the time in which the England and France and Spain and Portugal seized territories, had district colonial officers, and the colonial interaction was carried out in very spectacular methods. Whereas coloniality, as formulated by our decolonial scholars, especially the majority of whom are from Latin America, including people like Anibal Quijano, Ramon Grossfogel, and then some not, although with Latin American heritage, like Walter Mignolo and our own Sabelo Ndovugacheni. Coloniality speaks more to what I think it's Quijano characterized as the colonial matrix of power that continues into the present, that continues into the foreseeable future. So it is not something that is past, but it's something that's carrying on in different ways from that which was started centuries ago. So I think it's important to make that clear. And because many, even if we speak in terms of economic issues, management issues, legal issues, issues of jurisprudence, many people relate, many people claim, and even in political science in general, and international political economy in general, people say, but colonialism is past. Why do you keep talking about this? And even now that I say it, there are people who believe that, who will still say it after this talk. But it's just a piece of information. So if you are interested, you could Google coloniality and see how these scholars make a very clear, and I think a very successful distinction between historical colonization and what I formulate as contemporary colonization. Prof. Siepe talked about the psychological trap for Africans in his reference to Verwoerd's comment that will make African people know that equality with white people, with Europeans, is not something for them. He makes a very good point that I agree with. But I also think, Prof, so let's see whether we can quarrel a bit here. Not necessarily a quarrel, but whether I can extend your thinking or push you to think in this direction. Is it not also a trap for Europeans, for white people? The impression that they are always, or they are meant to be superior to Africans. And in this regard, I quote Josep Borrell, who is the outgoing high EU senior diplomat. He made a very, very irresponsible statement 2 years ago, where he was saying that Europe is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. And the garden has to be protected so that the dwellers in the jungle do not come and invade the garden. And my response to Borrell in a short piece that I published was that there seems to be a problem, and a problem in the realm, I would say, of pathology among mainstream establishment Europeans. The illusion of superiority. I think it's as problematic to the Europeans, and I think this is also the case for many wars. America is now trying to impose a president on Venezuela. Like, why? How does it solve the housing crisis in Los Angeles? So we see Europeans, and especially the US empire, embarking on projects, spending money, killing their own citizens, sending their children to die in wars that I do not see how it adds to them. And I think it comes from this complex, this superiority complex, this idea that I must be superior to you, when even that superiority cannot be quantified and gives you no benefit at all. So that's one thing I want us to maybe think about. And then, of course, Prof made reference to the idea of development. And I was thinking recently, we talk about, and this is not original at all to me, somebody mentioned it somewhere. When we say some countries, or when some countries say that they are developed countries, and when they say others are developing, already there's the binary thinking, which is central to European epistemology. The us versus them, the good versus bad, the developed versus the developing, which actually is a mutation of the developed, of the first and the third world. It's just a recasting of that same idea, that binary idea. But does it mean that they are no longer developing? Because I know that right now, the US would die to be able to do better electric vehicles than China. So they desire development. The US continues to spend a lot of money on research and development. I think even now, they spend the most on research and development. Why are they doing that if they were already developed? So is there no scope for further development? And then again, when we talk of developing and developed countries, developed societies, is there any society that is not developed? I think it's a very racist term because it presupposes that a group of people are not developing, are not developed. Shouldn't we rather speak of wealthy countries versus impoverished countries? When you speak of developed land, if we use the metaphor of land, and I think that's where they lifted it from, this land is developed. What it means is that there's a house on the plot of land, right? That one is not developed. What it means is that maybe there's vegetation or there are no houses, right? But does the house on the earth that we stand, does this hotel add to the value of the ground? Is the earth on which this hotel built of a superior value than the one on which a hotel has not been built? I think not. I think not. So I see societies as impoverished, colonized, trapped, and some other societies as wealthy, the source of which wealth we may not want to engage in debates over. Whether that wealth came from looting the resources from other places, you think what you may in that regard. And then Prof speaks about the ideas and how ideas shape realities, how ideas reflect realities. He has one of his slides, which is one of my favorites, he didn't put up today, has a quote from Carter Woodson, African-American scholar in the, I think 2 centuries ago, from his book titled The Miseducation of the Negro. And it goes like this, quote, "When you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no back door, he will cut one for his own special benefit. His education makes it necessary," end quote. And I think that's because my thinking when we do some of these workshops on campus and in some presentations I've made, people tend to ask, what does this have to do with me? Like he's telling stories. He's telling political stories, he's telling historical stories. And the question we always ask when I facilitate interactive sessions is, what does this have to do with management? For instance, Shola, what does this have to do with management? What does this have to do with economics? Prof, macroeconomics. What do ideas have to do with sciences that have been presented as objective and free of historical or political bias? I think what Prof does is to tell us that precisely every idea, however it is presented, however it is feigned in its presentation, has to do with history, with political context, with worldviews. I think that is the power of the point that he makes in making us think of the geography of reason, the geography of logic, and the biology by which he means the provenance and the ontology, the kind of being, maybe biological, maybe physiological being, from which those ideas emanate and which those ideas serve and sustain. And so we get into the domain of terminologies that many colleagues have complained about, heavy terminologies. I spoke to one professor of the last workshop. He said, "Ish, these are your terminologies, ish. But I think it's necessary, and that's my concluding point, in formulating the policy the university documents for African thought, we talked about the need for, quote, vocabularies and grammars of change, end of quote. Because of the power of terminology, because of the power of language in the generation, in the articulation, and in the sustenance of ideas. The ideas you have, the ideas that I have, are linked to the language in which it is expressed. And that is why these terminologies become important. For instance, the idea of coloniality versus colonialism. Because colonialism has been presented as a historically fixed, sealed in a particular time in history, in a past. So the term coloniality had to come in to free the thinking away from that temporal box in which it has been placed by the term post-colonial. And that's why I quarrel with the term alternative. Professor Moyo is not here. He doesn't like it when I say that. He likes it anyway. We'll talk about it many times. Because the alternative, as a linguistic term, in its semiotic operation, suggests something in the fringe. When you mention alternative, you unconsciously are referring to the mainstream, to the center. We are referring to that which might be referred to, but does not have to be referred to. It's an alternative. You know, if you buy your bread from Pick and Pay and you are sending your son or your wife or your husband to the shops, you say, go to Pick and Pay and buy Sasco. Oh, but if in case you don't find Sasco, in case you can't go all the way to Pick and Pay, just go by the talk shop and get me Albani. So the alternative is implicitly devalued. So it's why I would say the other. But the other is a difficult term as well, because in European, especially in English epistemology, in English logic, the other is constructed as inferior. The self is centered and the other is pushed to the peripheries and constructed as inferior. So this is why it might be important. And so let me just do a little, let me be a bit selfish. Let me yield a bit to that temptation. But he spoke about mental production, the cognitive space, the empire of the mind, and he spoke about gratuitous respect. Thank you so much for that, Prof. So I was in this interesting presentation yesterday, and the presenter, the colleague, was talking about the one, Dr. Kenny, the one that you and your student presented yesterday, and they were talking about the effect of green energy, of greening the economy on human capacity development, right? Am I right, Dr. Kenny? Did I get it a bit right? Yes. And the colleague said the concept, the idea that human capital is central to economic growth was first articulated by Adam Smith. Am I right, colleagues? I teach English. Yeah, but so over lunch I told her, but this is the problem we have. When they were fighting wars 500,000 years ago, however long ago, in whatever part of the world, people who fought wars knew that your prime target is young, able-bodied people, especially men. Because they know that if you kill the young, able-bodied people, you have killed that society, you have killed the economy. How now do we ascribe that universal truth to one dead white guy? That's what Prof. Siepe is saying. Like when in physics, when they teach gravity, they teach it as if Isaac Newton invented gravity. And pyramids were built before his father had a girlfriend. Before his mother started menstruating. Pyramids were built. Those people who built the pyramids knew to put the heavy base at the bottom, because if they turn it upside down, it's going to what? Fall. So this is what Prof. Siepe is saying. When we put aside every source of knowledge in whatever discipline we are in, and we pick a convenient, citable Western source, and we ascribe all knowledge to that individual. And in so doing, we are limited in our problematization of the concepts or the articulation of those concepts. And we, in that manner, continue to reinforce, okay, now I'm out of time, that. I want to thank Prof. Siepe again. I want to thank the colleagues for this. I will be building on a lot of your work, Prof. Siepe, in the presentation I will make after lunch. This is the commercial break that I wasn't asked to do, but I will be happy. I want to say I'm thankful to the organizers. I'm very happy for this conference, the opportunity to interact with very intelligent colleagues and to hear perspectives that many of us are not used to hearing in the corridors that we have been placed in the university. And especially thank you for this task. Thank you very much, Prof. Siepe. You continue to enrich us, and we pray that you will continue to do so in many, many years to come. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Please don't go away, Prof. Because you enrich us always. Every time you're part of our discussions, come to the department when the faculty, from another faculty, never jealous about his knowledge, always willing to share his knowledge. So we would like to also offer you what a gift from us with all our hearts, saying thank you for enriching us. Thank you so much.
Right, colleagues, there has now been a change in our program. A very slight one. The good news is, well, there's good and bad news. The good news is we will now break for tea. The bad news is the group photo will only be taken this afternoon. I think it will just be better just to try and do some time constraints here. So I think it's just the guest speaker, the keynote speaker, that will be taking photos now. So ladies and gentlemen, the good news is we can go and eat. The bad news is photos will be taken or we will not be included in the photo this morning. Enjoy the rest of your day. Preliminary session will then start. Break away into sessions. I think the venues are the same as yesterday. And then obviously the session chairs, just make sure please that you are properly connected and that you have the necessary devices to start your sessions on time. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.